Some of you might be new to the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley, and I wanted to make sure right off the bat to kind of welcome you to what is a very special place here in Berkeley, Graduate School of Religion. We're actually about to launch a new form of our master's program with a reduced number of credits, kind of making it possible to get your master's in Jewish studies here in around a year and a half. And so we're rolling that out in the fall, and I really want to encourage those of you who have given some thought to doing some graduate work in Jewish studies to reach out. I'd be very happy to tell you more about graduate work here at the GTU and our online options. I also should say that we're very much a bricks and mortar kind of place as well. And I can see one of our classrooms here in one of the Zoom squares. Shout out to students and community members who are joining us here on campus. I wanted to announce that we still have spots in a 3-week modern Hebrew language intensive running from July 7th to July 25th. So please, you can send me an email. I'm on the GTU website. That's an in-person only learning opportunity, and I'm happy to tell you much more about that. And with thanks to our collaboration with the Center for Islamic Studies and the Madrasa Midrasha program, we even have some student fellowships to help out with that tuition. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I really would like to thank Toby Philanthropies. They gave us a special grant for this GTUx series, and their trust in our kind of academic and, let's say, artistic endeavors is really much appreciated, and we're very excited. We couldn't be luckier than to have had Naomi Seidman bring her thinking to a GTUx project. What is GTUx? Because you may know that tonight we are only going to screen 2 of the 4 modules of this series after Orthodoxy. Let's say you want to see all 4, which I highly recommend. It's as easy as going to the GTUx website. Maury Lipset, our doctoral student here at the GTU who's helping out tonight, thank you, Maury, is going to throw that into the chat, so that you can you kind of log into GTUx, put in an email, and get access not just to After Orthodoxy, but actually to a whole host of rich materials on the study of religion. One of the GTU's taglines is "Where religion meets the world," and we do try hard to support scholarship at the intersection of, kind of lived experience and the world of thought and ritual. I wanted to mention in terms of our format tonight that we're thankfully a nice big crowd. And so after we do the 2 screenings, there will be a chance for the speakers to get some questions from you. But the way we're going to do that is in the chat. So I want to invite you now. I'll be moderating the chat throughout the evening to put comments and questions in there, and I'll curate those and then direct them to both Zalman and to Nomi as time permits. And this is a 90-minute program, so we will definitely, at Pacific time, we will conclude at 7:30 p.m.
6:30.
Excuse me, 6:30 p.m., 90 minutes. Thank you. Allow me, I'm going to keep it short. I wrote up these long introductions, but then once we get into things, it's just so exciting to dive in. It's hard to do the full introduction, but I'll keep it as short as I can. With us tonight is Professor Naomi Seidman, as well as Professor Zalman Newfield. I'll tell you about each of them. Professor Naomi Seidman, no stranger to the GTU. Naomi taught here for, I'm going to say, nearly a quarter of a century, because it's true. Is currently the Jackman Humanities Professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of the Study of Religion and also at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. Her 4th book, Sarah Schnerer and the Beis Yaakov Movement, A Revolution in the Name of Tradition, won a National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies in 2019. A 2016 Guggenheim Fellow, Professor Seidman recently completed a study of the Hebrew and Yiddish translations of Freud's writings during his lifetime. That book is called Translating the Jewish Freud, Psychoanalysis in Hebrew and Yiddish. Nomi's podcast on leaving the ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, Heretic in the House, is, I think, still available on the Shalom Hartman Institute website. Heretic in the House. How could you not listen to a podcast with that name? But hopefully we'll get to hear from Naomi about her work maybe on that, and then how that connects to this project tonight, the project After Orthodoxy. So Naomi, welcome to this evening's program. And I will also introduce now Zalman Neufeld. Zalman is an associate professor of sociology and Jewish studies at Hunter College. He received his PhD in sociology from NYU with a focus on cultural sociology and the study of identity, narrative, and re-socialization. He holds an MA from NYU in sociology and a BA from Brooklyn College, CUNY, in psychology. Before joining CUNY, he taught sociology courses for 2 years in 6 New Jersey state prisons through Rutgers University Newark's New Jersey Scholarship and Transformative Education in Prisons program. His research focuses on the process individuals undergo when making major life transitions. His book, Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Leaving Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, explores the lives of a group of men and women who were raised in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities and decided to leave that way of life, a process that he personally underwent. I also know that he is currently spearheading a project in which the transition from yeshiva study to college studies is supported through a program. I hope we can learn about that maybe as we discuss as well. So welcome, Professor Neufeld, to this evening's conversation.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with all of you.
Yeah. So I want to just turn right to both of you, and maybe Naomi, if you're willing to kind of start us off and just like tell us how this project came to be and what you were drawing on in bringing it to fruition.
Hey, is this okay? Because I think I'm just a little box on my own screen, but how big do I have to be? So I'm big in my own mind. A lot of different things. I thought of the idea. So this comes out of this idea I've been cooking up for at least 10 years, which is a kind of festival devoted to people who've left the Orthodox community and their accomplishments afterwards. Like instead of the dramatic story of how you leave and the trauma, not that those things aren't true and important, but a kind of festival. And one of the reasons why it's so odd, I think, to think about a festival and required some mental health from me is that part of me is like still thinks it's a little bit, it's about trauma, it's about break, it's about difficulty, it's about all these things. And the idea of having a fun party and an academic conference, because I'm an academic myself, that seemed like a kind of punk thing to do. And I tried to persuade various people to do it with me in earlier iterations. Felix Posen, this philanthropist who also grew up Orthodox. And then something happened around 2 or 3 years ago where I was introduced to Zalman's work. And it really had a very, so Zalman's book, which is this book that you mentioned about leaving ultra-Orthodoxy, and it's not about me exactly, because he interviewed Satmar and Lubavitch, people who left those communities. But he said all kinds of things that made me think that the story of leaving Orthodoxy was more complicated than either popular culture or even myself, how I thought about it. And it was very inspiring. And for instance, in Heretic in the House, he asked how those things are different. I had an episode called Shunning that it was really a spin-off of Zalman's, Zalman's discovery that the people that he was interviewing, despite their coming from these very, very Orthodox places, were not being shunned by their family. There were all kinds of like in between situations. Um, some members of the family were, some weren't. You're sort of half shunned, and then you're shunned for a while, and then you're not shunned. And I thought that's so interesting, and it so reflects my own experience. So at some point, I didn't know Zalman well at all. I think I had met him once at a conference. I just called him up and I was like, Zalman, you want to do this with me? And he's like, sure. So I just want to first of all, I want to thank Zalman for doing this thing with me. I want to thank, if it's okay, I can just run through some quick thank yous. I want to thank the GTU the GTU is about religion, not about people who left religion. And them going like, yeah, sure, we'll do that. And Jennifer Rupert, who I think I saw her name, she might even be here. And then and Maury and Dina, just all your support over this process, and the film production company, which I think is called 50 Squared. Sarah Person was lovely to work with. And who else? There was one more. Oh yeah, Lonnie Santo, who I see right there on the screen. Sorry, Lonnie Hancock was the mayor of Berkeley, which you are not. You're the mayor of Footsteps. So the existence of this organization, which they co-sponsored the festival, and all my friends and students that I see on screen, thank you so much for coming. So that's just a little bit of what I had in mind.
That's amazing. What you're talking about in terms of you're realizing that there's a story to be told, and an experience that needs to be reframed.
Yeah.
Maybe. And then I'm wondering, Zalman will, of course, also have a chance to hear from you after we screen the first episode in which you are featured, actually. But what drew you to tell the story in your work?
So in terms of my own work, as you mentioned, I had gone through this process. I grew up in the Lubavitch Hasidic community in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, and went through the entire Lubavitch educational system, and then gradually came to realize that I didn't quite fit the mold of a kind of good Lubavitcher, and doing and thinking the things that you're supposed to do and think according to the Lubavitch doctrine and community standards. And I gradually went through this process of kind of moving away from the community. And yet I remain deeply connected to it. So one of the real inspiration for my dissertation, which became my book, Degrees of Separation, was to try to explain and kind of go a little deeper in terms of what does the identity of people who grew up in the ultra-Orthodox community and eventually leave it, kind of where do they end up socially, religiously, psychologically, and that I discovered that like any graduate student, any good researcher, I tried to see what the literature says, what have other scholars on this topic what have they discovered and how did they explain this phenomenon? And they tended to describe it in very binary terms. So either a person was part of the ultra-Orthodox community or they were out of it. And that there was this idea that, once you left, you kind of never look back. You just were disconnected and you moved on, and you had one chapter of your life end, another chapter begin, and it was all very kind of neat. And I knew that certainly did not reflect the messy reality of my life and my relationship with my parents, my relationship with my family, my relationship to my Lubavitch upbringing and experiences. And as I started to interview people for my research, I realized that their life also didn't conform to this kind of neat binary of before and after. And so that, is, I hope, captured in the title of my book, Degrees of Separation. Yes, people leave the ultra-Orthodox community, they go through a major life transition, they change significant parts of their personhood, how they look, how they dress, how they act, what they eat, what they think about God, the Bible, and so on. And yet there's all kinds of ways that they're still deeply attached to their upbringing. And to Nomi's point about the festival slash symposium that we ended up putting on earlier this year at the YIVO Institute in Manhattan, I think that a big part of the inspiration to make the program, and then I think a big part of the kind of feeling during the program itself, was a recognition of this idea that people's lives are complicated. People go through these transitions and end up in all different places, ideologically, philosophically, socially, and so on. And we were trying to as much of that as possible, rather than kind of rely on one sort of flat, one-dimensional.
Are we waiting for me to? I dropped out for 1 second. Are we waiting for me to share the screen?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And Dina, thanks for explaining that there was a conference and a festival, and now and these interviews were recorded at that conference festival. There's an old Jewish joke. Two Jewish guys are walking when one notices a sign on a Catholic church that says, "Convert to Christianity and we'll give you $100. The one says to the other, "Should we do it?" The other says, "No, are you crazy?" The first guy replies, "Hey, $100 is $100. I'm going to do it." So he walks into the church, and a little while later he walks back out. The friend says, "Well, did you get the money?" He replies, "Oh, is that all you people think about?" Most of us don't have the experience of moving so dramatically from one kind of identity to another. That's a good way to describe my life as someone who grew up strictly Orthodox and now lives basically as a secular Jew. I'm Naomi Seidman, and this is me now. I'm a professor of religion at the University of Toronto. We're all familiar with the fascinating stories of people leaving strict religious traditions. This series is about the other ones, the ones who go back in some form or another, who keep in touch.
It'll be fun. I'm already having fun. Bling.
One way people come back is through their scholarship. Take Zalman Newfield, my co-organizer for the conference and festival we put on this subject, After Orthodoxy. Zalman is a sociologist at Hunter College who writes about what it means to exit a Hasidic community.
I was raised in a community, the Lubavitch Hasidic community, that did not teach any secular studies. I didn't learn the ABCs. I didn't learn 2 + 2 is 4. I didn't learn anything about physical science, let alone the social sciences. And that a big part of my own evolution was that I developed a kind of secret library that I kept with me for a bunch of years, and secretly read these forbidden books, and that was a big part of my discovery of the outside world. And I felt like that was really why I left, because I read these books, I learned about the outside world, and I came to understand how confining being in the Hasidic community was for me.
Zalman's story may seem familiar. The strict religion, the search for autonomy that leads him to the broader world. He used to consider himself a heretic of the intellectual variety. Now Zalman thinks there was a more emotional reason he didn't stick with the religion in which he was raised. He had a younger brother, Shimmy, who died of cancer when Zalman was 16.
I realized that actually Shimmy's death had a great deal to do with my decision to leave the Lubavitch community, but I think I only came to understand this once I learned about other people's stories and came to have, ultimately a fuller appreciation of my own.
There was another thing Zalman belatedly came to realize. Hasidism and his life afterward, they weren't so different. In both cases, what was crucial was books, and it was the rabbi in his yeshiva warning him about his secret library who taught him just how important secular books were.
I was absolutely terrified. But looking back, I feel a certain kind of kinship with this rabbi because I think ultra-Orthodox culture appreciates books and knowledge, even if, it results in trying to forbid people from reading certain books because they think that they're spiritually dangerous for the readers.
It isn't just the bookishness that carried over. Zalman always thought there was something else he had picked up in his Hasidic upbringing, a kind of self-confidence. Let's call it chutzpah.
I have a kind of measure of that chutzpah, so even though I'm nervous about, organizing this festival, I feel like, what the heck? Let's do it. It'll work out somehow. And I think my Lubavitch upbringing, I think it gives me a certain kind of assurance that I'm able to do things, even though the things that I'm doing might be very distant or even unrelated to my upbringing.
So don't take his being a sociology professor as the measure of his distance from Crown Heights, the Hasidic community he grew up in. For Zalman, sociology is a way to keep him connected.
One of my sisters jokes that I'm, more up to date on, internal things that are going on in the Hasidic community than many members of the Hasidic community. For me, this is my vocation. So I have to know exactly which Hasidic Rebbe said what and how did his followers respond. And so it keeps me very informed about what's going on in the Hasidic community. And I certainly enjoy that. And I mean, I have great love for the Hasidic community, even though there's many things that I fundamentally disagree about. It's a kind of blessing for me that I'm able to have a job where I'm not a part of the Hasidic community, but I'm still able to engage in it regularly.
I've said that people like Zalman have lives that fall into a clear before and after, and maybe that's true. But the more you dig, the blurrier it gets. That before can't be entirely before if it keeps changing. That life you lead after, it's more connected to what came before than people might realize. Shaul Magid, who also spoke at our conference, has a different kind of story than Zalman's, maybe a less familiar one. He didn't grow up Orthodox. He joined as a teenager.
I grew up in a suburban New York secular home and was part of the kind of late 60s, early 70s counterculture. I didn't really have much of a Jewish identity, but decided that I thought it would be a good idea to kind of go to Israel. And that was really, in a certain sense, the beginning of that part of the journey for me. And so after I went back to the US, after about 5 or 6 months, I moved to Borough Park in Brooklyn, kind of became Hasidic, Haredi, kind of dressed the part, studied in yeshivot.
What Shaul helps me see, what he helps his students and readers see, is that Hasidism isn't just a strictly religious way of life. It's also a counterculture.
Emmanuel Levinas, the French Jewish philosopher, uses alterity, to live in some other parallel world. And when I first was exposed to ultra-Orthodoxy, coming from a secular Jewish background, I felt that alterity. So I'll give you one example. I was walking through the streets in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and I came across a poster on the wall of a synagogue. And then underneath it said Parshat Noach, which is the Torah portion that's read that week in synagogue, without any date. And I remember saying to myself, I was probably 19 at the time, this is living otherwise. This is alterity.
That alterity Shaul is talking about, that Levinas was talking about, he eventually gave it up one Saturday afternoon in Bloomington, Indiana, when he was 50.
I think a lot of people who lived inside of Orthodoxy remember like the first time they desecrated the Sabbath. I remember driving through towns in Bloomington, Indiana on a Saturday afternoon, and it's really the first time I had been driving around on a Saturday afternoon since I was 20 years old, and realized that this world has been going on without me for the last 3 decades. And it wasn't without, as I said, it wasn't without a real sense of anxiety.
For Shaul, being a scholar, and even more so a public intellectual, that means that he's always going to keep in touch with Hasidism, whether or not he drives on Saturday.
I've tried to basically pull out what I think are really important contributions that that world could make to the world. And I think that I was very impacted, as many of us were in my generation. I'm 66 years old, with the New Age movement. You know, we've gone beyond the New Age movement, but I think it impacted all of us and allowed us to think about how we can contribute to the kind of rethinking about the kind of capitalistic, materialistic, consumerist American culture that we're all very much a part of.
Shaul doesn't gloss over the problems of Orthodoxy today, and he knows that leaving is a lot harder for some people than it was for him. But he understands why he fell in love with ultra-Orthodoxy as a 19-year-old and thinks it still has a lot to offer.
People who are coming from that world want to tell their stories, want to expose the dark side of that world for completely understandable reasons. But there are some of us, and maybe those of us who didn't come out with the trauma, who think that there's a way in which that world can contribute to recalibrating and rethinking some of the banalities of the contemporary Jewish world as it exists. So I think that hopefully, like, both of those sides can work together.
Jewish studies and its long history could hardly exist without those of us who took the path into or out of traditional societies. There's a reason that joke I told at the beginning of this episode is a joke and not a historical anecdote. Most people don't change in the course of an afternoon, even if, after sitting in the car for 10 minutes on a Saturday in Bloomington, Indiana, we turned the key in the ignition and started driving.
Wow. I just feel like jumping in if I could. Just Zalman, I mean, watching this now, watching that interview at this point, like, what do you think about how you're portrayed and the ideas you shared?
Well, I think it's interesting. I remember, as I often do, I spoke for a while during the interview, and I wondered, like, what would actually be used, and would any of what I said make any sense? So I was certainly very glad to see the final product. I think it's really beautiful. The editors and Naomi and everyone who put it together and worked on it, I think did a great job. One thing that the piece captures that I mentioned, which is really central to my research and to my thinking about my own experience. And I should just mention that in addition to the academic book that that I wrote that was published a few years ago, I actually also wrote a memoir about my experience growing up Lubavitch and leaving, and that should be out in the fall. And pandemic, and as a memoirist, I've thought a lot about this question of motivation. You know, why do people go through this obviously kind of major transition and potentially very painful, if not, and sometimes even traumatizing transition? You know, why do it? Why go through all this? Why? Who needs all these tsaras? Who needs all these, you know, this anguish? And if you read, for instance, the kind of growing canon of ex-Orthodox memoirs, there's often, you know, a certain kind of portrayal of this process that focuses on the kind of intellectual aspects of this journey and kind of intellectual discontents that people have with ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Often this relates to either internal contradictions within the Bible or contradictions between the Bible and the physical sciences, evolution, or whatever it is, you know, and people basically say, well, I discovered this and I immunity or this way of life or whatever. And that's clearly very important to the people who go through who sees and to do my research, I realized that there's an emotional or social aspect to this journey that's also very, very important. And I actually found that people tended to divide, even among the people who I interviewed, they tended to divide into these two camps. One camp I call the intellectualist camp, the other camp is a social emotional camp. And they tend to frame their journey as either one of intellectual exploration or one necessitated by traumas or hardships or challenges related to social and emotional issues. And I realized ultimately that these are both kind of narrative mechanisms. These are ways of describing particular stories about leaving, but that in actual fact, I would argue probably every single person who goes through this major transition has both kind of intellectual aspects to their journey and social emotional ones. But because of their upbringing, especially if they're male and went through the Haredi ultra-Orthodox yeshiva system, which focuses a lot on the Talmud study and kind of making intellectual arguments, this idea of describing their transition as both motivated by and kind of framed by this intellectual quest could feel especially comforting to them. And as some people who I would characterize them as having described a kind of intellectualist explanation for their leaving, when I told them emotional things such as abuse, they said, "Oh, those people are not real, heretics or real exiters. People many times by the teacher in the yeshiva, so they're kind of blowing off steam by shaving their beard and leaving the community. But after a few years, they'll calm down once they realize how difficult it is to make it in the outside world, and then they'll come back to the Hasidic community. And that only, according to this narrative, only the people who leave for quote unquote intellectual reasons, those are the real heretics who will stay out, for good." And again, I would argue that both the intellectualist and the social emotional narratives are just that. They're narratives. They're a certain kind of self-fashioning that people go through in order to make sense of their experience for themselves as well as for others. But that in point of fact, everyone who goes through this process has both intellectual and social or emotional reasons for doing so, because everyone has both a mind and a heart. It's just a question of what we focus on and how we frame our personal stories.
Thank you. Wow, you've given us a lot to chew on. I want to turn to you, Naomi. It's interesting because talk about framing. Naomi, you are the framing voice of this series. So on the one hand, I feel like asking you to get in front of the camera a little bit and share from your own experience. But before we do that, or maybe as part of it, I would just love to hear some of your thoughts about your consideration of the framing of this project, and also just maybe also some of the gendered aspects of how to present this process. I mean, and whether you feel those differences are explored robustly and, but really just either the very large question of just here you are, the voice behind the images. And you had such a hand in crafting these episodes. Would love to hear your thoughts about the crafting of the episode, what you represented, and in particular, how you dealt with the very difficult issue of gendered representations in this process.
Yeah, which I feel a little defensive about for reasons I'll explain. So first of all, how it's framed. The 4 episodes are the way I also conceived of the festival. We conceived of the festival, which was in 4 parts. One was scholarship after Orthodoxy. And there was a third scholar who was supposed to speak. And I'll explain a little bit about how I constructed how we work, the process of putting this together. The third scholar, I can say a little bit about what she was going to say. And she backed out for complicated reasons at the last minute. So we ended up having two men. The second episode is religion after orthodoxy. And we had people who became non-Orthodox rabbis, basically, after leaving Orthodoxy. We had Jericho Vincent and Amichai Lavi. Go see Sabbath Queen if you haven't seen it. And then the third one was activism after Orthodoxy. So what does it mean to be involved in Orthodoxy as an activist, as a community, as a public figure after you leave? And then the fourth one was art after Orthodoxy, which was really the kind of kickoff of the festival part. So filmmakers and musicians and who draw inspiration from, and that's what we'll see. That episode is, I think, how we'll close out this part is what we decided. In terms of my process, and then I'll talk a little bit about gender. I didn't know how to do this, so this was all I was instructed. So I was asked to write a series of questions for the various people that we were going to interview. I chose people based on these four topics, who I thought might have interesting things to say about what it's like to be a rabbi after you leave the Orthodox community, a non-Orthodox rabbi. And then the filmmakers, I wasn't actually there for the interviews. They interviewed these people during the festival. They grabbed them for a minute during the conference, and they interviewed them for a long time. And then I was given the transcript, which was many, many, many pages long. And I had to pick out, and we had, 10 minutes for each episode. I had to pick out, 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes worth of things that people said, and then construct a narrative around it. And without, having had any real input on, in the conversation, those weren't conversations with me. So that was how it worked. I guess that's how you do something like this. I had no idea. I was learning as I did it. In terms of gender is such a huge, important question here, because the ultra-Orthodox community in which I was raised, in which all these people, were raised or lived in for a time, or some of them were modern Orthodox, is extremely sexually segregated. And the experience of what it means to grow up ultra-Orthodox is really different for boys and for girls. And just of the part that, Zalman was saying, that there are all these men he interviewed who were so proud of their heretical abilities to argue with their rabbi teachers. For girls, that was not an option. Heresy was coded male. No one cared what we believed. The only thing they cared about was whether we hung out with boys at the pizza store, and whether we would be like virgins when we got married, and then, good mothers for the rest of our lives. If we didn't believe, interesting, but you're already a weirdo in my case. Like you're thinking about those things. What. And one of my big struggles as an adolescent was to assert the right to be a heretic. And there's another sense in which you have to assert the right to be a heretic, which Zalman talks about, which is that not only are you coming up with your own narrative, and I love how he frames that you're constructing a kind of narrative. And one of the insights I had is that my narrative keeps changing, just like Zalman's keeps changing, right? The path keeps changing. But the narrative that you have is in some way an argument that you're having with the narrative that the ultra-Orthodox community says about you, right? So when you're trying to leave, before you have the gumption to leave, before you can figure out how to do it, where the exits are, you're hearing all these stories about this person left and that person left, and they're always filled with a kind of horror and shame. And there's never any kind of option that says, oh, and they had intellectual doubts. It's always framed as some kind of psychological issue. Well, no wonder they never had. I've been told, oh, you didn't, we weren't nice to you in elementary school. That's why you left, by various people I went to school with. I'm like, thanks for not being nice to me. I'm glad I left. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a very quick way is there's a narrative struggle about what it means to leave. that you have to, you're already in before you even leave. And how you frame it and what it how it continues to change is part of what I was thinking about here and also I won't talk about the differences. And then just one more thing, which is that the third person, the woman who was going to talk about how OTD scholarship, off the derech, ex-Orthodox scholarship informed her own work, was someone who wrote, I don't know if I should say her name because she wasn't, but she wrote this brilliant piece about how reading wrong, like reading the Bible wrong, like your teacher is trying to teach you some lesson about God, and instead you're getting a lesson about sex, which is, finding that place in the Bible, that's actually a generative scholarly method. So that's what we would have heard if that had worked out.
And that's Professor Rona
Roni
Mizell,
Mazel, yes,
who has a book.
couldn't be part of it the last minute, so that was a
Yeah,
shame.
but they have a book about reading wrong that I'm very excited about, and that should I think be coming out in the near future. And yeah,
So reading wrong, in other words, being rebellious or skeptical or weird or unfriended, ultra-Orthodox woman, it turns out is a very useful hermeneutic method for producing your first academic book.
So, Nomi, if there is this narrative struggle, was this festival and this series like a part of your narrative formation?
Yeah, I mean, it's understood. Thank you for saying that, but it's understood that, okay, it's bad enough you broke your parents' heart. It's bad enough you wrecked your siblings' marriage prospects. At least you can slink off somewhere and shut up, right? Just, be kind to these people. You don't make, don't make a big deal about it. It's bad enough you did it. It's hurtful. Move to California and keep your mouth shut. And, whatever you do, don't involve the Orthodox community. Don't bring more shame on people. Don't expose them to more criticism than they already get in this era of anti-Semitism. Whatever the issues are, there's some way in which I felt that the biggest favor I could do to people who I've hurt so badly without necessarily wanting to hurt them is to just be quiet about this thing and not, quote unquote, drag the Orthodox community into this. And the Orthodox community is hypersensitive. Anytime talking about their own accomplishments, just saying, I had a pretty good life after I left is hurtful. And to do that in New York and to make it open to Orthodox Jews and to try to bring Orthodox Jews into the conversation, right? We awarded this Righteous Frum Person Award to try to build bridges between Orthodox people and ex-Orthodox people, that we don't want to hurt you, but we do want to live a real life. We don't want to live a bullshit life. We don't want to slink away. We have something to say. We're still your friends. We're still your family. We're still your community in some sense. We're still part of it. We still identify with you, and we're not going to slink off. I mean, it was very easy for me to slink off because I moved to Berkeley, but to come back to New York and to put on a public event, and Zalman and I were on this Orthodox radio program. Man, that was a crazy Q&A. Right? Which starts at midnight after Shabbos. And, people said all kinds of things like Footsteps, which is an organization to help people who leave Orthodoxy. I already mentioned it. The executive director is in the room somewhere here on Zoom. That is understood to be a missionary organization by the Orthodox community. Which is very funny because the Orthodox community openly proselytizes, whereas Footsteps is like you have to be 18. They give you a really hard time. They're very far from proselytizing. So just to explain what the dynamics are, it's like we threw a hand grenade into this complicated social field, which could be called the border region between Orthodoxy and those who left it.
Thank you. And we're going to have a few more minutes of discussion before we show the second episode. I can't resist. One of the questions in the chat is asking both of you, but but directly to Zalman also. How did you catch up on the secular education you missed as a child? And I want to ask you that
He
because
did catch up.
because in part you're kind of working right now on providing resources for people engaging in exactly that. So any thoughts on the first module of this series is called Scholarship After Orthodoxy, and somebody's asking like how?
Right, right. How much time do you have? I have a lot of thoughts about catching up. I'm not sure if I have entirely. I think this is one of my kind of obsessions. As you can't see it; it's off camera, but there's like 7 bookcases right next to me in my dining room, and they're just full of a fraction of the books that I've obsessively collected over the years and obsessively have tried to read. And my wife, who grew up, is Jewish and grew up in a sort of conservative, capital C, Jewish community, so quote unquote regular American Jew. She laughs at me that I've read a lot more of the classics of Shakespeare and Dickens and whatever than or Greco-Roman literature, whatever, that than a lot of people who grew up in regular kind of secular American Jewish homes and had secular education their whole life. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, it's just because I've become obsessed with trying to catch up, trying to make up for lost time. And yeah, I mean, the short answer is that the yeshiva system that I attended was both very demanding and also very lax. So the program started at 7:30 in the morning or something and went till 9 o'clock at night. But most of the day, we didn't have regular classes with a rabbi lecturing to us. Instead, it was a chavrusa system, a buddy system, where you all sit in a big hall, a study hall, and then 2 partners are supposed to work over a text of the Talmud or some other ancient or other dense piece of writing. And eventually I started to, as you saw in the video, the clip, I started to read English on my own, even though I wasn't taught English. And I eventually collected a lot of books and would secretly keep them in my yeshiva dormitory. And then I would sneak off during the yeshiva day to read in my dorm. And eventually I spent most of the time in the dorm just reading these quote unquote Goyish, non-Jewish books. It turned out a lot of the books were written by Jews, about Jews, like Shalom Aleichem and Isaac Bashevis Singer, and books about Zionism and the Holocaust and things like that. But these were considered Goyish or not Jewish or forbidden, heretical, problematic because they were not on the curriculum, they were in English, and they were not supposed to be read. And it turns out if you devote countless hours to reading books, you really could learn a lot. So that and a little bit of chutzpah helped me prepare for the GED to get my high school equivalency diploma, and with that, entrance to college. And I just sort of kept on reading ever since. So
Can I jump in and ask you a question? Have you thought about, like Nomi pointed out, that in a way heresy was a male option, that you could read these books and you would be recognized as taking up a path of critical thinking and intellectual freedoms? And have you, when you in your teaching, when you talk about these 2 tracks away from the ultra-Orthodox community, the intellectual and the social emotional, have you considered the gendered aspects of those tracks?
yes, well, Nomi helped me think about this because we spoke about this once. I guess I think it was after my book. It must have been after my book came out, which is a shame because I might have done the book a little differently with Nomi's insights. But definitely, I was, as a sociologist, my training is in sociology, my graduate training, and so I was very interested in the question of gender. But I was thinking about it, maybe not surprisingly, in a very kind of limited way. And so I was thinking about kind of gender exclusion and like So I would ask I interviewed 74 men and women who grew up and left the Hasidic community. And so I would ask the women, very kind of crude questions like, did you want to learn Talmud? And you weren't, because they weren't taught Talmud the way the men were. And I said, well, like, did you miss that? Did you want to learn that? And almost to a woman, they said, no, we had no interest in that. Like, why would we? We had enough problems with what we were being taught. We were not looking to crack our head on obscure ancient, texts. So I knew, of course, that that wasn't the whole story, but I didn't have a good enough sense at the time of how to look in a more subtle way for the differences in gender. I mean, one thing that I did that just came out in the in my interviews and shows up in my book a lot is the question of clothing. So for mostly for the women that I interviewed, they often, when they were talking about their experience as a Hasidic woman, or their experience leaving, or their kind of issues with the community, they often talked about the restrictions that were placed on them in terms of the kind of clothing that they were required to wear, and based on this idea, a very strict idea of modesty, the tznius, and so that was a kind of say, so to speak, a sore spot, or even a point of trauma in some of their lives. So that came through very well, and shows up in the book. But in terms of a broader understanding of the differences between how men and women go through this experience, there's a lot more to be said about it. But definitely this kind of hyper intellectualizing that's very, very common in male yeshiva spaces shows up a lot in the kind of narrative construction of those men who leave the community. And in the women's narratives, it shows, there's very kind of different framing mechanisms.
Thank you. I'm aware of the fact that I'm sort of standing between everyone and the next episode. Nomi, did you have a quick response to that?
No, to see. I mean, this is such an interesting point. I mean, I think it's something you pick up in the liberal Jewish community, the exclusion of women from Talmud study, such a big thing, right? Like, and the fact that Zalman couldn't find any woman who grew up ultra Orthodox to say, oh yeah, I was dying to study Talmud, like Yentl or somebody, is I think it's such an interesting phenomenon, and it's something that is true of me. I wrote something recently called "Why I Don't Love the Talmud," and the assumption is women aren't allowed to be part of it, so they must be desperate to want to be part of it. And what other stories are there to be told is I think what we're getting at. But I don't want to keep people from watching episode 4. And Lonnie, sorry that we're going to watch episode 4. I just think it makes a good. Maybe explain why we're watching episode 4. It's like the punchline, the climax.
Well, if I could just interject one thing, not to, I don't want to be in trouble either, but I do want to highlight one thing that Nomi was telling me, from the beginning when we were talking about the program, the initial program at Evo, like it, in addition to being intellectually stimulating, it should be fun. Like this should be fun. This is an exciting kind of circus. This is a fun thing that's going on. And I really appreciated that insight, kind of the joy of the heretical process, the heretical experience, leaving ultra Orthodoxy, and that, as Noe mentioned, again, I think a lot about narratives and narrative structures, narrative arcs, and so on. Like when you read memoirs or stories or even news articles about people who leave the ultra-Orthodox community, they're often focused on the trauma. And the trauma is very real, and it makes a lot of sense, and is very appropriate socially, morally, psychologically to give that a lot of space. But at the same time, there's also or could be great joy in the lives of people who have left, who have fashioned and refashioned their life in ways that are exciting and joyful to themselves and hopefully to the people around them. And I think that was important for Nomi to kind of highlight that at the the event at YIVO. And I think that the fourth episode that we're going to watch really expresses this point very well.
In the decade since I graduated college and left Brooklyn, a lot of things have changed. Williamsburg, where my Hasidic cousins lived, is surrounded by gentrifying neighborhoods where tattooed hipsters and Hasidim share sidewalks. One of the ways Yiddish-speaking Hasidim refer to these neighbors is as artisten, as if they were all artists rather than high-tech bros or bakers or cafe workers. Artists? That's the outside world. Them, not us. I think that's the implication. But of course there were and are Hasidic artists, performers, musicians. So what is art after Orthodoxy? If art is freedom, is Orthodoxy an obstacle to being an artist? Or is it rather a source of inspiration, melodies, material? Take Loser Twersky. He's an actor, living in a mostly secular world. But every once in a while, when he's lucky, he gets paid to put on that garb again, grow his beard again. Playing Hasidic roles pays his way in the big world. But it's also one of the things that keeps him connected to his upbringing. He moved away, sure, shaved his beard, but the life he's chosen requires that he put on those clothes again, speak Yiddish, become the Chassid he was and in some sense still is. What used to be the way he dressed, now it's his work, his art.
I've never really emotionally fully left. I've always loved the music. To this day, 15, almost 20 years later, this is the music I listen to every day. This is what I love. This is what puts me to sleep at night. But also because, when I decided to go into acting and to go into filmmaking, I had to use my comparative advantage, right? Otherwise, I'm just another kid, who wants to be an actor. But here I had some comparative advantage. I had, a language that very few people spoke. I had a background and a cultural background that very few people had. So I had something to offer for those specific roles.
Loser's competitive advantage isn't just that he can walk the walk and talk the talk, but he's also determined to make it more than that. He knows perfectly well that he's part of a shift in how Hasidim are represented in popular culture, the shift that makes it easier for people like him to find acting jobs. Hasidic characters, as he sees it, are individuals, not some image of a black hat, diamond dealer, Yiddish-speaking, foreign-looking stereotype. When he plays a Hasidic Jew, it's a specific person he has in mind. In that way, he protects his community, their dignity. It isn't just his Hasidic past that Loser brings to his work. He thinks people who leave Orthodoxy, people like him, have a unique perspective on things, an ability to move past some of the stuck places in the broader culture.
It's very interesting to have people who are American, completely American, but they are discovering America like immigrants. So I think that all of us have a very unique point of view on the world, because we bring that experience that caused us to, for some reason, take such a hard break with something that's family and comforting and familiar, and just go headfirst into the unknown.
Some of the filmmakers Loser works with share his background. Pearl Gluck is one. She casts him in a lot of her films, including the one we showed at the festival, Castles in the Sky, about an Orthodox woman who sometimes takes the train into the city to perform in poetry slams. Like a few other people we interviewed, Pearl feels that it isn't really accurate to describe her as having left Orthodoxy, much less gone off the derech. It's clear to her that even if she doesn't follow all the rules, she's still living in it.
It's tempting to say that you left in order to talk about coming back, but I don't think I ever left. I did make decisions that didn't continue in a path that was laid out by my early education.
It isn't just the films that are set in the Hasidic community that express her Hasidism. She made a film about sex trafficking at truck stops in Appalachia. It's called The Turnout. That film might seem very far from Hasidic Brooklyn, but as Pearl sees it, that film has just as much to do with her upbringing as any of her other work.
I was raised with a very deep ethical upbringing, which is part of being Hasidic, which I think gets talked about a little less than usual. I feel like that's still part of what drives me. Even my film about sex trafficking at truck stops, if you ask me, certainly not my family, but if you ask me, that's as Hasidic as anything else I do. Because of my whole upbringing of making a difference in this world and leaving the world a better place than you found it. I mean, where else did I learn that?
Maybe no artist can really parse where their inspiration comes from, what was there from childhood and what came from somewhere else. Basia Schechter is a singer, songwriter, composer, and cantor. She went to the same Orthodox girls' school in Brooklyn that Pearl did, that I went to too. Where does her music come from? Sure, her family, her community. But is that the whole story?
So I grew up with a father who was always banging on the table and singing and had this side of him that was clearly an artist. And it's almost like he was that and I'm not that, you know? I like to harmonize, and I always loved harmonizing with my father. So like Shabbos tables, harmonizing in school during recess, harmonizing is just part of life. It's like nobody thought of themselves as an artist. They felt like either they can carry a tune or not. And so I think it was really interesting because we were all girls, but we needed to find our individual sound, our individual line, our individual notes to kind of feel like we were standing out, but also part of a whole.
This might surprise some people, but that girls' school we all went to, Beis Yaakov, was full of music and dance and theater, these huge, crazy productions, they were called. Basia was a standout in those. But art, it meant something different in that context.
And it was only girl dancers in front of girl audiences. But still, like, we couldn't move. So no, you can't do that move. No, you can't do that move. No, you can't do that move. So it was like a very censored, sensory and censored experience. But you start sensory in the sense that you start noticing your body moves in ways that you're like, whoa, I can do things in my body that feel like they're touching the forbidden fruit. And the more that we weren't able to do it, the more I wanted to find places I could do it. And experience my body in different clothes.
When Basia performs, she gets to wear those clothes. She gets to sing in front of mixed audiences. But even in all that freedom, there's something deeply religious, too, about a lot of her music. Basia has a crazy memory of the moment she became a musician.
I had an early experience, a very young experience, that I had a desire coming home from school where I learned these beautiful words, and they were Ilufinu Malay Shira Kayam. If only my mouth were filled with song, and it was just beautiful, and I really enjoyed it. And so there was something in my being that wanted to write a melody for it. And there was something scary about doing that, or it felt illicit, so I went into the bathroom and tried to do it in the bathroom. And the craziest thing happened when I came up with a song and it wasn't good. The pipes in the bathroom broke, and it all of a sudden poured into the bathroom, and all of a sudden I was like, I did something wrong, But I realized I had the impetus. I had this desire to create. There was a creative spark.
That was one formative moment, but it wasn't the only one. Basia plays world music, and that music she plays, it comes from a lot of places, not just Brooklyn. After high school, like a lot of Orthodox kids, she spent a year in Israel, a year that's supposed to help with spiritual development and cement your Jewishness. That's not how it worked out for her.
I used to go to bars and dance and discovered alcohol, and then I came back from that, and then I got kicked out of yeshiva and ended up in Egypt. And I heard the music of Egypt, and that was a very formative moment where I felt like this music is my music. This is something in me is having a massive tuning fork experience with Middle Eastern music. I felt like, whoa, how am I hearing something that's for the first time, but feels like it's in my DNA, and it's coursing through me as if it was something that I forgot.
Like a lot of us, Basia is still figuring it all out. That story she told about the pipes breaking in the bathroom when she first decided to write a song, It's not really clear, even to her, what it means. The conference and festival that Zalman and I put together, the one I'd been dreaming about for years, it didn't resolve all my questions. I still don't know what we should call ourselves, this fractious band of people who really, really resist any attempts to figure out who they are once and for all. This big thing we have in common, what is it? How do we describe our entanglement with our own histories? I was glad when the academic discussions and the arguments about the accuracy of the term off the derech, when all of that quieted down for a minute and Basia and Shaul and Ricky and the other musicians picked up their instruments and started to play. The lights dimmed, but something opened, something lit up. It was as if the lights had come on and I could see who was there. We do have a beautiful segue of Basia singing with her amazing band. She sang a variety. There's also at the end of a different episode, I forget which episode, there's a minute of Ricky Rose singing. And Ricky Rose, I didn't even know who she was. And now she's like, since our quote unquote conference festival, she's everywhere. She's like the next big thing. And that's just amazing. So check out Ricky Rose too. Basia Schechter, Ricky Rose, they're all over YouTube. Amazing music. In Ricky's case, really influenced by her, very obviously influenced by her Hasidic background, but also that's true for Basia. And I hope you saw that. Turns out that Shaul is also a musician, etc. So the musical part was the best part of the evening, I thought. Oh, and there's Lonnie driving, and she's in episode 3, I believe.
Thank you. And maybe Lonnie has an invitation to issue. Do you want to issue it now?
Yeah, it's a good segue. First of all, I'll say, Nomi, you don't even know that I sing also. So one of these days,
I
Zalman
know.
knows.
Lonnie's an
Zalman
So you
amazing.
knows.
sang at our festival?
No, no one asked, but that's
Oh
cool.
my
No,
God.
all
Well,
my
now
friends,
we
I was
know. We
so
have to do
happy
it
that all my
again.
friends were there. Sorry for the lighting. I'm in San Francisco on my way to Berkeley, actually, which is why I asked Dina to take me off mute because I know me, you know where I'm going, but I don't know if people in this room might be interested also. Footsteps is also a big piece of what we do is celebrate the joy, and bring the joy, and certainly we support people who are going through the depths of it. And we also work on building community. And so when we have the opportunity and we're out of New York, we do a lot of things in New York, but when we happen to be out of New York, we also like to gather folks who are fellow travelers, that is, Exeters, Per Zalman, Fry folks, OTDers, Exos, if you want to go back to Basia's days. So we're going to be actually in Berkeley tonight from 7 to 9. If you identify as having grown up Orthodox and you are no longer Orthodox, you're invited. It's basically a gathering of those who are after Orthodox. And we'll be at a restaurant called Jupiter from 7 to 9.
Thank you,
We're very
Lonnie.
familiar, right? I'm so excited. And thank you I actually double booked, and Lonnie was like kind enough
No, we
to
moved it.
move the time that we're
Yeah,
meeting.
we're
We
happy
could do
to.
2 OTD things in one day, a meetup and a Zoom call.
So
There you go.
So it's a big OTD day, and yes, also OTD Nachis for those of you who are not in Berkeley.
amazing. So, what I've been thinking and what I'm going to do now is mostly facilitate the Q&A, that the questions that are coming in from the chat. But what I've really been struck by a little bit in terms of both of your work actually is to some extent like there's an assigned role that you're given in the narratives of leaving Orthodoxy, not your own. So you're just not playing your assigned role, and that's really disruptive. And that's where the punk joyful festival thing comes in. But we are getting a question in the Q&A that kind of does pick up some of the more somber tones of the experience. One person asks, is there a particular aspect you are still grieving from exiting your community or your Orthodox worldview? Do either of you want to speak to that?
I'm happy to, but I'm happy to have Naomi start off.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's really a very difficult thing for a family to quote unquote lose a child. And and to be the person who made that happen, to be the one who, my parents were Holocaust survivors. They did not abuse me in any way. I mean, other than raising me ultra Orthodox. They're kind and sweet people, and they were devastated when I left. And those still in the community, those of my relatives, both of my parents are gone now, but oh, I see Kamala's there. It's something that you really feel like why couldn't they have just done it? Like, would it have been so terrible to just, mumble a few words on various things? I don't know how to describe this as the thing I grieve. And then there are also things I miss. And among the things I miss is, I mean, I think sometimes people exaggerate how much community there is in the Orthodox world. I mean, I went to an elementary school, Beis Yaakov, which Pearl went to and Basi went to, a lot of people went to. It had 1,000 girls when I was there. I mean, the classes were totally overstuffed. The idea that we're living in some kind of like candle lit, stained glass, your old world community. It's like we're in the bustling heart of Brooklyn. It's true. I was, I don't know what community is. I don't think I think it's kind of an easy thing to say that we left a community. But I think you and I know, Dina, that that there's something about living in you live as a kind of independent contractor. You go from a collectivist world to an extremely individualist and materialist world. I mean, not that the Orthodox world doesn't have its materialisms, but what do I miss? I miss the food. I miss the singing. I tell people, I start singing. People are, oh, you want to hear some music? I'm like, no, I don't want to hear some music. I want to make some music. Um, to whatever all that stuff was. I mean, Shabbos like drove me absolutely bananas and was also very beautiful. I know Zalman has some kind of Shabbos practice. So yes, there's a lot. There's a lot that I grieve, that I miss. And part of it is, part of me is I feel very lucky that at least I teach Jewish studies and that I can teach about it, or I can be immersed in it in this somewhat distant way that allows me not to be infuriated by it too. So I think which I am. I mean, when I go back to Brooklyn, I'm so filled with fury and disgust, and like there's no question that I had to leave. I'm curious to know what that is for you, Zalman.
So I kind of second everything that Naomi said so beautifully. The one thing that I would add, so there's many griefs, many levels of the grief. And just to put out there, everyone's putting out little ads for different things. I was in therapy for about 15 years from the time I left till last Tuesday. So I'm a big fan of therapy, and I think that my sort of joyful disposition, let's say, has been very much enhanced by therapy, to deal with, among other things, the kind of grief that I went through during the process of leaving the community, and then ever since then. But one other kind of aspect of the grief or thing that I miss from the ultra-Orthodox, from the Orthodox community, is the certainty. That when you grow up in the Haredi ultra-Orthodox community, you're told this is exactly the thing that you're supposed to be doing. And not only that, but this is what God wants you to do. And on some level, this is why the universe was created. So you could do this thing, that there's kind of not only a certainty, but a kind of cosmic significance to everything that you do. If you make a bracha, you make a blessing on a cup of water. Wow, according to the Kabbalists, like this was, the ocean was waiting for you to scoop up this cup of water and drink it and make a blessing at this moment. Like, how fabulous. I mean, if you could believe that, if you could feel that in your bones, as I think many people in the ultra-Orthodox community do, like, wow, you really have a pep in your step. You really have a sense that you're on a cosmic mission. You can't fail. The whole Jewish people, all the ancestors going back to Moses or Abraham, are looking down from heaven, waiting for you to take every next step to fulfill this cosmic mission. It gives life tremendous purpose, and it gives you a tremendous sense of certainty. And I think in the sort of secular, modern, postmodern society that we live in, it's much harder to have this sense of certainty. People do all sorts of things. Many of them are positive, productive, pro-social, whatever. But are we absolutely sure? Is this the thing we're supposed to do? Maybe we should have done some other thing. Maybe we should have done something else first. Maybe we should have done this in a different way. Who knows? But in the ultra-Orthodox community, the thing they're not lacking is certainty, and I think there's definitely a kind of grief, especially during really difficult times. When my wife was trying to give birth to our second daughter, and there were medical challenges, and ultimately it all worked out, and we have the daughter. She's doing great. She's going to have her bat mitzvah in a few months. It's all okay now, but at the time was terrifying, and ultimately she was born through a C-section, and I'm just standing there like a yuckle, waiting, hoping, praying that, to the God I don't believe in, that the baby should come out alive. It would have been fantastic if I was still a believer and I could turn to an actual God and say, please, God, make sure that this works out the way that it's supposed to, So I think that there's all kinds of ways or all kinds of moments where it would be great to have that kind of certainty, that kind of assurance in your life, that kind of a belief in the cosmic significance of everything, even the very mundane things that we do. But alas, that's not my life. I'm, I have to make do with all the same kinds of things that other people who are part of the secular, society do, and hope that we have to use our reason and try our best to calculate what is appropriate and good and ethical and proper, and hope that our decisions ultimately lead in the direction that we want them to.
Thank you. Your words are making me think of an episode we didn't watch together, the one that was called Religion After Orthodoxy. I'm wondering maybe, Naomi, if you had a thought or two to share about, I feel like it's related, Zalman, to what you're saying, that you're still trying to make meaning out of life without the structures that you grew up in and their certainty and their direction, and what kind of either meaning-making projects or maybe even art-making projects are available after Orthodoxy.
Yeah. So maybe I'll take this one. So for me, one of the reasons why doing Jewish studies has been so useful is that you leave, like the Jewish studies I had when I was growing up was in some ways, sometimes I joke, I'm monetizing my unhappy childhood. I managed to, you get some grounding in sources that definitely stays with you. But then there are the people that, you'll never really hear about in any kind of explicit way in the Orthodox schools that we went to in Beis Yaakov. For me, it was really the philosophers that have had the most impact on me are the Jewish philosophers dealt with the problem that leaving Orthodoxy is where is meaning in a world that, doesn't have the kind of Father God that, we were taught to believe in. And it's Spinoza and Levinas. Levinas Yael is asking how to access the other ones. Hopefully that's in the chat. So Spinoza, who himself, left the Orthodox community, and went nowhere, had nowhere to go, didn't have footsteps, and created the philosophy of pantheism, which to me is really a coherent way of understanding what God is, without believing in anything with the beard. The beards apparently are also God, according to Spinoza, along with every other part of the body. And the other one, and it's sort of funny that I have these two philosophers that don't really fit together, are Levinas, who Shaul was talking about, the face of the other. And for Levinas, Levinas basically, without abandon, let's call the God that is a being, and retained the God that is a commandment, but saw the commandment in that is, the commandment that is religion, the commandments that are religion, the ethics, concretely and phenomenologically in this world, in the face of the other. So the face of the other is what commands me, the pain of the other. And I guess I should just say, because I've been chatting a little bit with Kamal, that for me it feels very odd to be doing anything but talking about what's going on and the suffering that's happening in Gaza right now, the kind of forced starvation. And, all of this has also to do the political issues we have with the people we come from. And I'm sorry, I'm not being very coherent, but in other words, it's not totally irrelevant in this format to talk about who we are ethically. And, Levinas tells us that the suffering of the other is what commands us. And we are commanded by what we see. And right now, what we're seeing is the suffering of the other, including what looks like an imminent mass starvation of the population of Gaza. And to take that as a kind of ethical truth, as opposed to taking the kinds of ethical truths that I, was taught in Beis Yaakov in a lot of spaces, where just to say what I'm saying now is a real heresy, though not everywhere, right? Because there is a range of political belief in the ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic world. So that's what's been on my mind. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about ethics and where one finds one ethics if you're not following a rule book called God's Torah given on Sinai.
Thank you for kind of bringing us to this conversation about ethics. I was talking about meaning making, religion after Orthodoxy, and you brought us to the kind of really pressing matters of ethics and meaning making at this time. And we're so glad that we have here in the Zoom room, part of the GTU community, and Kamal Abu Shamsia, who's the head of our chaplaincy program, asking a question in the chat about whether or not there really is a kind of niche here, Zalman, to use your language, people making this kind of transition and the spiritual, social, and emotional needs that show up, and how we can provide support for people at that time. I think is something that you really speak to, that Footsteps speaks to, and I appreciate, Kamal, your inputs on that, and wondered whether this conversation about meaning making after Orthodoxy, and especially in terms of the situation in Gaza, in Israel, Palestine, a sense in which humanity right now is really just grasping for some firm footing in a time of so much violence. And maybe I'll ask you, Zalman, if you are willing to share, of the struggles after Orthodoxy. I guess, Naomi, what it is you've introduced a new episode just now, which is ethics after Orthodoxy.
Right. and also politics, because one of the things people might not know is that the ultra-Orthodox world has a kind of a history of anti-Zionism, and then it's become increasingly, so there's a kind of political stance, and one of the questions is, where do you go politically? Where do your politics go when you grow up in one political situation and move into another one? I think a lot of us, it's not just people who leave Orthodoxy, but I think a lot of Jews, maybe shouldn't speak so generally, but I will, are having a kind of, I want to say, coming to Jesus moment, like trying to figure out what their politics are. I mean, there's just trying to figure out what they're, where they stand, as opposed to, let's call it, the religion in which they were raised. And it's a ferment, and it's also, it changes how we see our past when you grow up Orthodox. Sorry, I realize that it's now Zalman's turn, and I'm going to mute myself because of my dog.
It's all good. I would just say to kind of piggyback on what Nomi was just saying, I think it's interesting. I think and I know we're going to run out of time, so I'll keep it very brief, but there are many parallels, I would say, between the kind of personal transition and transformation and resocialization that individuals go through as they leave the ultra-Orthodox community, that have very strong parallels with what's going on now on a kind of macro level with the Jewish community globally. And I think one insight, if you will, that and obviously it has to be developed a lot more, but one insight that may be helpful that comes to mind is that on the personal level, where I've spent a lot of time studying this kind of transformation, we realize that this is a very painful process, because all kinds of truths, things that you were taught from a very young age, things that you believed were set in stone, were proper, were unalterable, suddenly become upended, and people are have to scramble to find a new sense of identity, a new sense of purpose, a new sense of themselves. And I think that there's a similar hope, possible transformation going on now with the global Jewish community, where with everything that's going on in Israel Palestine now, people are asking are starting to ask kind of fundamental questions. What exactly does ethics mean? What does the Jewish tradition, and more generally the tradition of ethics, require of people to do in a given circumstance? And how do we make sense of all these things? And these are really challenging questions for any individual, and certainly for communities to engage in. At the same time, these are questions that are really necessary to engage at exactly this time.
Thank you so much. Just wrapping up, I really want to thank both of you, Nomi and Zalman, for the thoughts that you shared this evening, and also for the creativity that you put into the festival in New York, and these episodes that capture, I think, so much of the vitality in these individual trajectories, and I mean, more collectively, the culture of after Orthodoxy. So I thank you all for being here, and I wish you well, and we pray for peace and for healing, much needed. Good night, everyone.